On the night of February 2nd, 2021, sheriff's deputies from Kai County were called to the home of Daniel and Kendy Howard around 11 o'clock. The scene was one of chaos and anguish, as Dan Howard, a former Marine and state trooper, was beside himself with grief. He had just found his wife, Kendy, lifeless in the bathtub. Through his tears, Dan insisted that no foul play was involved. However, as investigators began to delve into the details, they started to suspect that the evidence painted a different picture. Today's case is a complex one. Investigators in Kai County pursued it as a homicide, believing the scene to be staged, although medical experts disagreed on the cause of death. The physical evidence raised suspicions but failed to provide clear conclusions. Over several years, the investigation was driven largely by intuition and the feeling that something was amiss or that someone was not being entirely truthful. Let's explore the details of this case. In February 2021, Daniel and Kendy Howard had been living in their Athol home for nearly 2 decades. They had raised 2 children, Brooke, Kendy's daughter from a previous relationship, and Wyatt, their son, together. Both children had lived in the family home as adults, although temporarily. Brooke was a new mother, and Kendy cherished her time with her granddaughter. Recently, however, the children had moved out, and tensions began to rise in the household. Daniel Howard, 55, had transitioned from the Marine Corps to a 20-year career in law enforcement, serving as both a sheriff's deputy and an Idaho state trooper. By early 2021, he worked in Alaska, with a schedule of 3 weeks on and 3 weeks off. On the evening of February 2, he had been home in Athol for just a few days. Around 11 o'clock, Dan reported that Kendy had prepared her usual evening bath at 9 o'clock, but hadn't reemerged. When he went upstairs, he discovered his wife of 27 years dead in the bathtub, with a handgun submerged in the water beside her. When deputies arrived, they found Dan Howard pacing outside, distraught and inconsolable. Deputy Miranda Thomas, the first on the scene, noted Dan's unusual behavior. He gagged without vomiting and cried without tears. Inside the house, officers cleared the rooms to ensure no one else was present. Paramedics were called to the scene, despite Dan's assertion to the 911 operator that his wife was already dead. Upstairs, in the bathroom, deputies found Kendy naked in the bathtub, with a semi-automatic handgun submerged in the water and a spent shell casing nearby. Kendy had suffered a gunshot wound to the head. Initially, the scene did not appear to be a homicide, but certain details didn't add up. There were no clothes or a bathrobe in the bathroom, only decorative hand towels that matched the room's decor, not suitable for use after a bath. Kendy's purse and cell phone were on the counter, out of her reach. More troubling was the evidence at the scene. Kendy had dried blood on her face that flowed in the opposite direction from how she supposedly fell into the tub, suggesting she may have been repositioned. Her hair was splayed in a way that defied gravity, and there was no blood spatter on her hands. The bath mat was soaked, but the rest of the floor was dry. Deputy Thomas also noted fresh deodorant stains on Dan's shirt, despite his claim that he had showered around 3:30 that afternoon, more than 6 hours before the deputies arrived. Shortly before calling 911, Dan had been doing laundry, evidenced by a running dryer with 6 minutes left on its cycle, which Deputy Ben Wheeler noticed upon arrival. Wheeler, new to the jobs, deduced that the cycle had started just minutes before Dan made the emergency call. Dan's DNA was not found in the bathtub, but was present on a magazine in Kendy's purse, located on the bathroom counter. During the investigation, Dan called both his children, Brooke and Wyatt. Upon hearing of her mother's death, Brooke immediately accused Dan of murder. Kendy's parents, whom she had spoken with just hours before her death, were not notified until the next day when they drove to Athol after being unable to reach her. The autopsy was conducted by Dr. John Howard from the Spokane County Medical Examiner's Office in Washington, who had no familial relation to the Howards. Despite the investigative team's suspicions, Dr. Howard concluded that Kendy had died from a single gunshot wound, deeming the manner of death undetermined. In 2013, Dan faced accusations from the County Prosecutor's Office of threatening to kill a friend, Matthew Wood, after learning of Kendy's alleged infidelity with him. Brooke described her mother's misery in the marriage, highlighting Dan's dichotomy of public affection and private cruelty, often belittling Kendy with insults that impacted her self-esteem, leading to extreme dieting and plans for plastic surgery. She also alleged physical abuse, supported by photos of bruises Kendy shared with friends months before her death. Dr. Jennifer Nara, a colleague who reviewed Dr. Howard's report, found discrepancies, noting Kendy's body had multiple bruises sustained before her death, indicative of blunt force trauma. These bruises, particularly on her chest, suggested an attempt to cut off her airway. A second-degree burn on her arm implied she had been exposed to hot water before being placed in the tub, supporting the theory that she was shot post-mortem to disguise the true cause of death. Days before her death, Kendy had scheduled cosmetic surgery and discussed her future plans with Daniel and her parents, painting a picture of a woman moving forward with her life. In late January 2021, Kendy called Daniel via Facebook Messenger during a heated argument with Dan. Daniel overheard the argument and alerted Kendy's parents, who contacted the sheriff's office. Deputies visited the Howard's home, where Kendy discreetly indicated she wanted a divorce and planned to leave. After Dan attempted to reconcile, calling her numerous times to apologize and claiming it was a misunderstanding, Kendy decided to return home to finalize her divorce and attend appointments in Ethel. Daniel testified about his relationship with Kendy and their future plans, contradicting Dan's narrative that Kendy was distraught over losing her dream home. Witnesses, including Kendy's daughter Brooke, best friend, brother, and parents, testified about her disdain for firearms, which made the notion of her handling a gun unlikely. Dr. Howard's autopsy findings remained a point of contention, as the defense used his testimony to argue that Kendy's death was consistent with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. However, prosecutors challenged his credibility, citing previous concerns about his professional conclusions in other cases. During the trial, Dan Howard violated his bond conditions by being at the Spokane International Airport after curfew, leading to his arrest and revocation of bail. His defense argued he was merely assisting a friend, but the prosecution suggested it indicated a potential flight risk. In closing arguments, the prosecution reiterated the evidence suggesting Dan had the motive and means to kill Kendy. The defense countered by questioning the lack of clear evidence and the absence of items Dan allegedly used, such as gloves or black clothing. After 9 hours of deliberation, the jury found Dan Howard guilty of second-degree murder and domestic battery, but not guilty of first-degree murder. In May 2024, Dan Howard was sentenced to life in prison without parole for murder, alongside a concurrent 10-year sentence for domestic battery.